During a recent interview, Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California said something that was both rhetorically compelling and substantively profound about the difference, the critical difference between the Democratic Party and the current iteration of the authoritarian cult that is the GOP. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, so this is actually several days old, and I wanted to discuss it, but there's been like more pressing, attention-grabbing news that I felt like we needed to discuss first. But Eric Swalwell, Democratic congressman from California, and he was also a presidential candidate in 2020. Sorry, I had brain lapse there. He's one of my favorites. He's becoming even more blunt and terse. He's great at pushing back, along with like Jamie Raskin, for example, on the BS that comes out of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. He's very, very good at it. This was something he said during an interview with CNN's Jim Acosta. And again, rhetorically, I thought it was very compelling. And I think it spoke to the substantive difference between the Democratic Party, which again is flawed. It's imperfect. We don't do everything right. We don't have all the answers. I think in many cases we don't go far enough. We're not nearly as aggressive or progressive in certain respects on politics. But the difference between the Democratic Party, with all its flaws, and the current iteration of the Republican Party. So let's play the clip and we will unpack it together.
Thanks so much for doing this. In this call that McCarthy held last week, he argued that House Republicans should focus their energy on other matters. What do you think? Is this going to happen? And what do Democrats do in the House about this?
We are pro keeping the government open, and that's the difference.
To clarify, this is in reference to the looming threat of a government shutdown at the end of the month. Government funding runs out at the end of the month. If there's not an appropriations bill that passes the House and the Senate and is signed into law by the president, the government will shut down. And this is, of course, triggered by a Republican Congress, as it almost always is in modern history. And so Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, is well aware of what this will probably do to his polling. Americans typically tend to blame Republican Congresses when the government shuts down and they pick a fight with a Democratic president. They tend to be blamed for it. So it's another political minefield that Kevin McCarthy does not want to traipse through, given his current other political complications.
The difference between Republicans and Democrats. They like to rule, we like to govern. When it comes to ruling, they want to rule your body, they want to rule what you read, they want to rule how you vote, and we want to govern, we want to fix things, we want to get things done. When I-95 collapses in Philadelphia, we want to be the party that gets it open in 16 days. When COVID hits our country, we want to reopen main streets, churches, and schools. And when your healthcare costs are rising, we want to be the guys that bring down Medicare costs, because you now can negotiate for the prices. So that's what we do, Jim, and so we're going to be ready to do that. It's just a matter of, will McCarthy choose chaos or will he choose competence?
So I thought that was beautifully put. Republicans want to rule. Democrats want to govern. And I've said this before, the current iteration of the GOP has no interest in governing and ruling only in as much as they get to be supreme, right? Usually ruling and governing, work hand in hand, but the verb in this case, when you govern, you're actually doing things, you're administrating, you're overseeing, you're actively involved, you're actively engaged in running the country. Whereas rule implies almost like a monarch, like a distant monarch. You're not actually running anything, you just get to be supreme and kick back. And that really is what the GOP wants. They want to, from on high, throw down these edicts and these commands, which often don't make sense, which are often incredibly harmful, which are often arbitrary and cruel and capricious. And then that's it. We see the Republican Party, when it's in the majority, it cares only about tax cuts for the rich, which shifts the tax burden onto poor and middle-class people. They're interested in judicial vacancies so they can shape American jurisprudence for decades to come. That's it. In terms of a robust policy agenda, they don't have one because they know their policy prescriptions suck. They know it. Incredibly unpopular. So they can't compete with the Democratic Party in the marketplace of ideas. They lose every single time. So instead, they want to rule. They don't want to govern. They want to rule. And when they're in the minority, all they want to do is just obstruct, obstruct, obstruct. Now, he gave some examples. He talked about, COVID management. That's one. So President Biden presiding over an enormously successful vaccine rollout, trying to maximize vaccination rates to prevent infections and death and allow the country to safely open back up. He gave the example of books. We see like a disturbing rise and increase in the banning of books from public schools and other places, particularly in red states like Florida. And then he also talked about, your bodies. Right? And so this is kind of what stood out to me when I saw this clip as an example. So in 2 conservative states, and probably more, the Texas law enforcement, Texas Attorney General, and the Alabama Attorney General, they are seeking to prosecute people leaving the state to go get abortions, right? It's not enough to simply restrict abortion access within their own borders, right? They want to prevent you from leaving the state to go get the healthcare services that you think are necessary and then return. It's dangerous. So Alabama Attorney General says he has the right to prosecute people who facilitate travel for out-of-state abortions. There's another one in the Washington Post. Highways are the next anti-abortion target. One Texas town is resisting. A new ordinance passed in several jurisdictions and under consideration elsewhere aimed to stop people from using local roads to drive someone out of state for an abortion. We are seeing an ever increase in these sorts of authoritarian tactics. He also mentioned the right to vote. We see that as well. Republicans believe. I don't even know if this is true. Like it is certainly true that they say it. I don't know if there's truth to the words themselves. I think actually Republicans sell themselves short. But numerous Republican officials, from Trump to Lindsey Graham to, Republican strategists, members of the RNC, believe that if you maximize eligible voter turnout in this country, if you make it easier and more convenient for people who are eligible to vote to become registered and exercise that right, they say Republicans will never win another election in this country. Now, that would be great if true, especially given the current state of the GOP, which is awful. It's a bad faith, disloyal, authoritarian cult. But I actually think they're selling themselves short. I think if they were able to moderate the rhetoric, I think if they were able to actually offer policy prescriptions to descriptive harms in this country, they would actually be able to stay incredibly competitive with the Democratic Party, because there's so many Americans who are just inclined to vote Republican anyway, based on culture war issues or tradition or whatever it is. It's the GOP that has given up the fair fight. Are Democrats more popular? Sure, but it's also in large part because Republicans aren't trying to be. They're not trying to be. They are clinging desperately to really unpopular ideas and doing nothing to change it. So anyway, I just like that, what Eric Swalwell said. I think that's a great turn of phrase. Republicans want to rule like some sort of cruel, capricious tyrant. And Democrats want to govern like statesmen.